At the beginning of the film, a police detective, Mark, is investigating the murder case of a woman whose body was found on an abandoned train track. The police identify the corpse and find out that the woman has no relatives or close ones other than her sick grandmother. Deeper into the case, Mark figures out someone paid for the grandmother's hospital bills 3 days ago, but the lady was killed 8 days prior to that. The police find DNA of the suspect who paid the bill, and surprisingly enough, it matches to that of the dead woman. Mark wonders, how could the lady pay the bill 8 days after her death? Another shock comes when the dead lady walks in to meet Mark, revealing that she is alive and well. Her DNA and fingerprints match with the dead body that was found, which confirms the police made no identification mistake. This is when we find out that the dead body has been thrown into their reality by a serial killer from a parallel universe. Since these two universes are different, the lady is dead in one and alive in another. Inspector Mark is yet to figure out how the portal between the worlds work and catch the serial killer from the other world. The scene shifts back to April 8th, 2008. Han Mina, a high school girl, arrives at home during a rainstorm. When she gets inside, she is shocked to see her dad lying in a pool of blood. We see that it is 9:35 p.m. on the father's broken watch. Elsewhere, Detective Mark, who is a kid, finds that his father has been hit by a car. Later, in the hospital, he is pronounced dead. Back at Mina's home, Section Chief O investigates the murder. Fingerprints lead to a repairman who was in the home earlier that day. He happens to be Mark's father. Since he is dead, he is removed from the list of suspects. After an investigation, Chief O learns that the cause of death in Mina's father's case is asphyxiation. He was strangled, then hit on the head. The murder weapon was a necklace taken from a jewelry box in the house. After his father's body is cremated, Mark is given a box containing the clothing he was wearing when he died. This would be a hell of a way to find out that your dad wears ladies' underwear. When Mark picks up his father's jacket, something falls out. It's a necklace, the same one used as the murder weapon. The series fast forwards to the present day in 2020. On a rainy night, someone rolls a suitcase along a set of train tracks. Blood can be seen trickling out of the suitcase. Meanwhile, we see that Han Mina now works as a prosecutor, and CO Mark is a police detective. They frequently work together on cases and know each other well. Mark has hidden the secret about Mina's father's death from her. One day, Mark and his partner Kim Jin-woo are out patrolling when they see a criminal driving away in his car. The detectives take off after him and end up on some old train tracks. Eventually, the criminal gets his car stuck in between the tracks in Mukyong Station. Mark pulls him out of the car as the criminal still brags that nothing will happen to him. Suddenly, he starts screaming, and Mark notices that the car's wheels stopped on a human skeleton. In his shock, Mark lets go of the criminal, who quickly attempts to escape. He tries to climb a steep hill and accidentally unearths a tote bag, which opens and spills out a second skeleton. By morning, the forensics team has found a total of 4 human skeletons at Mukyong Station, all in duffel bags with identically smashed skulls. The station, which closed down 5 years ago, is assumed to be the dumping ground of a serial killer due to the lack of CCTV cameras. Mark, his old friend and forensics specialist Lee Jung-min, says it will be difficult to identify the victims since they are all quite decomposed. However, by analyzing their jewelry, they all appear to be women, or perhaps Mark's dad. A short way down the track, Mark notices something strange, a nearby tunnel that's filled with empty candy wrappers. The bodies are taken to the National Forensic Service building, where Mina goes to investigate. The doctor tells her that all 4 skulls suffered the same blunt force trauma, but that the skeletons are so damaged, it's clear that the killer continued beating them well after they were dead. Mina gives the doctor the file on her father's murder, which sounds very similar to these deaths and has still not been solved. The doctor agrees that the skull fractures do look similar, but since she can't determine the cause of death for the recovered bodies, she can't say if it might be the same killer. When Mina gets home, Mark shows her the CCTV footage from the store that sells the candy, whose wrappers he found at Mukyong Station. He's recognized the man buying the candy as Lee Wook, Mina's former stepbrother. At Mukyong Station, a man stops by some train tracks to pull candy from his pocket, dumping the wrapper. He sees the body of the dead cat and begins to throw dirt over it with his bare hands. A policeman arrives at the scene and tells him that he can't be there, but he just continues covering the cat as he repeats, "Danger, mirror, traffic lights, stop." The man is Lee Wook, Mina's former stepbrother. The police take him home, where his mother, who is also Mina's former stepmother, Jo Young-ran, screams at the cops to just take him with them. Meanwhile, Mark arrives at the scene to talk to Wook. He realizes that Wook has become mentally handicapped since he last saw him. When everyone calms down, Mark reintroduces himself to Young-ran. She remembers Mark as the guy who took Mina to live with him after her father died. It turns out Mark took her in since Young-ran used to abuse Mina, and Wook would sexually harass her. Mark learns learns that Wook incurred a head injury when he was driving drunk and plowed into a telephone pole. He then approaches Wook, who barely acknowledges him, though Mark remembers beating the crap out of him when he assaulted Mina. Mark gives Wook a candy that he brought with him, then shows Wook a photo of Mokyong Station. He asks if Wook has seen anyone there, carrying a big bag or digging with a shovel. Instead of answering, Wook starts playing with the train set and repeating, "Danger, mirror, traffic lights, stop." Mark notices that he's written those words and some other random seeming words, such as mom, pig, and Buk Gyurungu, all over his bedroom walls. Buk Gyurungru is way more complicated than those other words. Back at the station, Mark tells Jungmin that he has a fingerprint from the candy wrapper that he gave to Wook earlier. He asks her to compare them to the ones found on the duffel bags. As Jungmin flips through some crime scene photos, Mark notices something interesting in the background. There's an old danger sign next to one body, a discarded mirror next to another, and defunct traffic lights by the third. He asks Jungmin to let him know when she gets the results on the fingerprints, and takes off. Next, Mark goes to the site where they found the bodies and locates each of the items from the photos. They just happen to be the same as the words Wook keeps repeating: danger, mirror, traffic lights, though he doesn't see a stop sign to go with stop, or even a wild Buk Gyurungru to go with the word Buk Gyurungru. Just then, Jungmin calls him to confirm that Wook's fingerprints match the ones found on the duffel bags. At the same time, Mark finds a stop sign, and it becomes clear that the words are reminders of where the bodies were hidden. He calls Jae Hyuk and tells him to look for anything connected with the word Buk Gyurungru, certain that there's a fifth victim and that the word Buk Gyurungru on Wook's wall will lead him to it. When he hangs up, he finds Mina standing behind him. She asks what he means about Buk Gyurungru and a fifth victim, so he explains everything to her. She believes that this means Wook also killed her father, but Mark mutters that Wook had nothing to do with her father's death. He adds that Wook isn't the same as he was 12 years ago because of his accident. But Mina isn't listening anymore. Instead, she sees a flyer on the wall for Buk Gyurungru Chinese food delivery. They split up to look for a fifth body, unaware that Wook has snuck away from his mother and is outside, digging another hole. Mark experiences a strange moment when he gets a sudden headache and hears a train, but it soon passes, only for Wook to hit him in the head with his shovel and knock him unconscious. Holy Buk Gyurungru, Batman. Meanwhile, Mina is inside the abandoned station, following more Buk Gyurungru flyers to a plastic trash bin that catches her eye. She removes the lid and there's a duffel bag inside with the body of a young woman. After knocking Mark out, Wook sees the glow from Mina's flashlight and follows it to her. Suddenly, the old clock on the station tower starts ticking, and as the minute hand ticks to 9:35 p.m., Mina finds a discarded train ticket on the floor for February 14th, 2020. An injured Mark slowly rouses on the track, just when a train that shouldn't be there barrels down on him at full speed. He leaps off the tracks just in time, and the train speeds past him. Inside, when Mina hears Wook coming, she hides, but he soon finds her when her phone buzzes. She accuses Wook of killing those women, and he attacks her with his shovel. Mark finds Mina moments later with Wook still looming over her. He grabs Wook and starts hitting him. Grabbing a gun, Mina asks Wook why he killed her father, but due to his head injury, he doesn't even recognize the man's name. "If it's not Buk Gyurungru, I don't want to hear about it," says Wook. She tells Wook that she's going to kill him, and as he listens, Mark's eyes fill with tears. Knowing that it's time to tell the truth, he says that it wasn't Wook who killed her father. He tells her that the killer died while he was running from the scene of the murder, and that killer was actually Mark's father. He also tells her how he found her late mother's necklace, the murder weapon, in his father's belongings. Their conversation is cut short when the cops arrive at the scene and take Wook away. Mark sits miserably as Jungmin processes the scene near the fifth victim. He notices a large burn scar on the victim's left side of the neck. Jungmin notes that the woman was killed the same way as the other corpses, as well as how Mina's father was killed. Once back at the police station, Mark reports to Director O that in addition to the fingerprints on the bag, there was also DNA evidence of sexual assault on the fifth victim's body, so they can do a DNA comparison with Wook. Mark tells Director O that he told Mina the truth. It turns out that she also knows about his father, as she was the one who investigated the case at the beginning of the series. Meanwhile, a detective brings Jungmin the bag of jewelry that was found on the victims, letting her know that they're ready to be returned to the families, though they have still only identified one victim. She notices that one earring doesn't have a match, which is strange since all the other jewelry is intact. In the interrogation room, Mark asks Wook if he admits to knowing where the bodies were hidden, but the latter does not provide any useful insight. Next, the detectives learn that the fifth victim is a 26-year-old girl, Gia. Unfortunately, her only family is a grandmother who's in a nursing home due to dementia. Meanwhile, Mark grows more and more frustrated as he asks Wook about Gia, but Wook just shakes his head and says he doesn't know. He chants, "A train comes, chug chug, puff puff." Past that shit. Finally, young Ran, his mother, arrives, and she confesses that she was the first person to find the bodies at Mukyong train station. She holds out a shaking hand and reveals the missing earring as proof. She tells them that she was walking Wook home from the community center one rainy night 3 years ago, when they found a suitcase that turned out to have a dead body inside. Mark points out that Wook's fingerprints were found on all the suitcases, and that he knew exactly where the bodies were buried. Young Ran says that Wook buried them. Ever since his accident, he gets scared and has fits when he sees anything that is dead. She says he buries any dead animals he finds, and later she learned that he was burying the human bodies at the closed station. Meanwhile, Jae-hyuk and Jin-woo visit the nursing home where victim Gia's grandmother lives, and the nurse confirms that she hasn't seen Gia in a couple of months. They deliver the bad news that Gia was murdered 10 days ago, but the nurse says that she was wired her monthly pay just 2 days ago. At the police station, Mina enters the evidence and finds a box named CO Mark, April 15th, 2020. Inside is the jewelry from the murdered woman, which she compares to photos of her mother's old jewelry box, and surprisingly, it's the same jewelry. She realizes that the murder is connected somehow. Next, Mark and Jae-hyuk meet up to check out the CCTV footage from the convenience store, where the nurse's pay was wired. They can't clearly see the person who did it, but they left behind a used coffee cup. Naha, the killer likes pumpkin spice. Mark then returns to the police station where Mina is waiting to ask him if his father had any other pieces of jewelry in his possession when he died. She explains that all of her mother's jewelry disappeared on the night her father was killed, not just the necklace. So if his father was guilty, then he'd have had everything on him when he died. Mark reiterates that all the evidence points to his father as the murderer. Meanwhile, Jungmin has done tests on the coffee cup, and the results have her thinking that it may have been contaminated because the DNA matches Lee Jia's, even though she died 8 days before the cup was left at the convenience store. Back at Mark's office, a young woman walks in and says that she is Lee Jia. To Mark's surprise, he stands there, utterly speechless. The Lee Jia standing in front of him even has the same scar on her neck that the dead Lee Jia had. At Mukyong train station, Mina is walking along the tracks in the rain. She pulls out the discarded train ticket she found for February 14th, 2020. The clock then strikes 9:35 p.m. and suddenly, the train signals begin to chime. Mina stands there confused as a train suddenly appears and whips past her. She can't believe her eyes at the sight of a passenger train appearing on an abandoned track. The train is completely empty apart from one person, dressed entirely in black, wheeling a large suitcase through the compartments. She hears a suitcase being tossed out of the train and walks over to it. She starts to unzip the bag when the cocking of a gun turns her head. A shot rings out, heard only by the sole patrol officer on duty. In the meantime, Mark and Gia sit in a private room, and she's shown photos of her dead self. While she tries to process what she's seeing, a call from Jae-hyuk further complicates things. The dead Lee Jia has the exact fingerprints as this Lee Jia, which means it can't be a case of unknown twins or mixed identity. Another call to Mark has him running down to the train station. In the next scene, the phantom train reappears at another station, this time full of passengers. A suited man disembarks with a gun in hand. Mark arrives at the train station and learns that the patrol cop discovered the new suitcase with yet another dead woman inside. The cop is confused himself, as no one has entered the premises except for a woman detective. That is, Mina. Not far from the tracks, Mark discovers Mina's limp body, shot through several times. He pleads with her to wake up as he sobs and calls out her name. We then finally see the alternate world. At the Mukyong train station in the other world, alternate Mark gets off the train and runs out of a building just before police run inside and find a man dead from a gunshot wound. He then escapes into a bathroom stall, and after injecting himself with drugs, he pulls his phone from a pocket and his ID falls out, identifying him as a detective like the original Mark. Back in the original world, Jae-hyuk finds a flyer for Mukyong Church inside the suitcase that held the latest victim. Partial fingerprints are then lifted from the church flyer. In a flashback, we see that Mina used the final minute of her life to call Mark and make sure that he knew that it was the culprit of the Mukyong station case who killed her father. At his desk, Mark pulls out the file on Mina's father. Looking at the case photos, he confirms all of Mina's mother's jewelry disappeared 12 years ago. The victims of the Mukyong station case case were wearing them. During a meeting to review the evidence on the serial killer's latest victim, Jae-hyuk reports that the fingerprints have been chemically erased, but the fingers are stained with a dye used on car seats. What makes victim number 6 unique is the fact that she wasn't wearing any of the jewelry that was stolen 12 years ago. Jae-hyuk then reports to Mark that 3 right-hand fingerprints were lifted from the church flyer. At the police station, Mark learns from Jae-hyuk and Jin-woo that the fingerprints match those of a man involved in a huge drug scandal 3 years ago, Lee Jin-sung. Mark was his arresting officer, and since no one knows where Jin-sung went after he left prison, Mark suggests looking up his girlfriend. Soon enough, they find the girlfriend, Park Min-kyung, in a club, and also Jin-sung, who attempts to escape at the sight of the police. In a flashback, we see that Min-kyung handed Mark a USB that contained the illegal ledger of Jin-sung while he was detained 3 years ago. All she asked for in return was a lighter sentence for her boyfriend. Back in the present, Mark recognizes the clip in Min-kyung's hair and guesses that it was a gift from Jin-sung. Pointing his gun at Jin-sung's head, Mark demands to know where he was 4 days ago, and he stammers that he was at work. Jin-woo and Jae-hyuk arrive and report that according to surveillance footage, Jin-sung is telling the truth. Jin-woo arrives to remind Jae-hyuk about the fingerprints, and he demands to know how Jin-sung's right fingerprints ended up on the church flyer. Min-kyung pulls off the glove on her boyfriend's right hand and reveals that his index and middle fingers have been cut off. The detectives are left in shock as their investigation has been stuck at a dead end. Next, Mark goes to the Mukyeong church but finds it deserted. He stands in surprise as the flyer lists a current schedule of events. Mark enters the empty Mukyeong church and finds a pamphlet from 2015 that lists the church's new name and location. He immediately visits that location and finds out that the church has been in that location for 5 years. Upon closely inspecting the flyer, the man points to the photo of a pastor and informs Mark that it's been 3 years since he passed away. In his car, Mark thinks about the 2 Lee Jias with identical scars, Jin-sung's missing fingers that somehow left fingerprints on the church flyer, and a dead pastor whose photo appears on a flyer for a church that's been closed for years. In the alternate reality, alternate Mark boards the train at Mukyeong Station, where someone recognizes him and calls 911. 2 detectives conduct a search of the train, as Mark is held up in a bathroom. When the detectives notice that the bathroom has been occupied for a while now, they pound on the door. Trapped, alternate Mark opens the door and punches his way out of the bathroom, and then hurries away. Back in the original world, the original Mark walks along the train tracks of the deserted station. He hears an approaching train, and his broken watch spins forward to 9:35. As the train races by, Mark sees Mina sitting inside at the same time that the detectives pursue alternate Mark with guns drawn. Outside, Mark manages to pull himself onto the speeding train, and after smashing a door's window with his gun, he gets inside. Still holding his gun, Mark searches for Mina, and when the train stops, he approaches someone who looks like her. Sadly, the woman isn't Mina. The detectives arrive at just that time to catch the wrong Mark. In the ensuing panic, Mark gets away, but he drops his case photos. Mark exits the train, and surprisingly, finds himself at a bustling Mukyeong station. He has arrived in the parallel world. As the detectives close in, Mark runs from the station into streets filled with people. He stops in front of Mukyeong Church, which looks nothing like its deserted counterpart in Mark's world. Mark is handed a familiar-looking church flyer by the pastor, who happens to be still alive in this world. Mark is forced to run when a police van arrives on the scene. When Mark stops to catch his breath, a warning shot is fired behind him. He turns around to see a woman detective who looks exactly like Mina. Next, as Mark gets transferred into custody, he sees Mina's badge. Her full name is the same, but her job in this world is a police officer. Mina slides a photo of drug trafficker Lee Jin-sung and accuses him of murder. Prior to this murder, alternate Mark was under investigation for an illegal drug charge, with Lee Jin-sung as his supplier. Mark doesn't see how the evidence points to him as a suspect. Determined to prove his innocence, he claims that he doesn't use drugs and consents to any bodily test to prove it. He adds that they'll know for certain that he isn't the culprit when they compare the bullet from his gun with the one from Lee Jin-sung's body. As predicted, the tests and analysis prove Mark's innocence, which further confuses the officers and infuriates Mina. In his cell, Mina resentfully unlocks Mark's handcuffs and says that she's ashamed that he's a fellow police officer. She certainly does not know that he is not the drug addict Mark from this world. Once free, Mark goes to work, where his colleagues give him an unwelcoming look. Mark looks through the files of the 2008 murder and learns that the exact same murder from his world happened here, except in this world, his father was framed as the murderer. Meanwhile, Mina is at Lee Jin-sung's crime scene. She searches the apartment, and her presence surprises Jung-min as she enters the crime scene. A while later, Jung-min Jungmin manages to find a hair clip from under the bed. Meanwhile, Mark waits outside the forensics lab and greets Jungmin when she arrives. Looking at the photos of Lee Jin-sung's murder, Mark recalls Mina's accusation and asks Jungmin if he could have killed someone since he's known to be corrupt and use drugs illegally. Jungmin reminds him that he called her on the day of the murder, insisting that he didn't kill Lee Jin-sung. Mark realizes that his other self did not kill the drug lord. She shows him the hair clip. It's the same hair clip that the girlfriend had in Mark's world, and he recalls the girlfriend's name, Park Min-kyung. After her encounter with Jungmin, Mina looks into Lee Jin-sung's call records and finds a repeating number that belongs to Jin-sung's girlfriend. The following day, Mark meets alternate Park Min-kyung at her home and shows her a photo of Lee Jin-sung. He soon notices that alternate Min-kyung is married with a baby on the way and has no connections with Lee Jin-sung. As Mark leaves the house, he notices a USB hanging from Min-kyung's car rearview mirror, the same one that Min-kyung in his world shared with him. Mark decides to confront Min-kyung, knowing that she is somehow related to Jin-sung. Min-kyung suddenly grabs her stomach in pain and is rushed to the hospital. In a flashback, we see that Jin-sung begged Min-kyung over the phone to not leave him for another man and threatened to tell her husband about them. The doorbell rang and Jin-sung asked Min-kyung to stay on the line. Over the phone, Min-kyung heard the scuffle and the gunshot. Back in the present, Min-kyung shares that on the day of his murder, Jin-sung claimed to have seen a dead body in a suitcase. In a flashback, we see that Jin-sung was shocked by the contents of the suitcase. He scurried away, but was met with alternate Mark, who cornered him. Jin-sung became a witness to the 6th victim of this serial killer, and alternate Mark followed the suitcase and killer onto the train. Mark then pieces together that both alternate Jin-sung and real Mina were killed because they had seen the contents of the bag. That is, the 6th victim. Later that night, Mark has a bad dream as a person limps upstairs to his house. At the sound of an intruder, he wakes up and quickly hides. Mark grabs the intruder and holds him down on the bed, and when he sees the man's face, he freezes. It's his father. Mark steps away in shock. Turns out his father is alive in this world. The series then goes into a flashback. A teenage Mark gets a call saying that his father left his phone at a job site. On his way to pick it up, Mina bumps into him, and he helps her pick up her things. In voiceover, adult Mark narrates, "The forked road envelops two worlds. That day, our two different choices changed our fate." In one reality, Mark just watches Mina and then continues on his way, while in another, he chooses to approach her. This creates a split in reality that births two different worlds with two very different futures. In one reality, Mark's father goes back to his customer's home for his phone. He is very drunk as he stumbles through the front door and briefly passes out. When he wakes, he's lying next to a dead body. He thinks the man is sleeping and tries to wake him, and a gold necklace falls from the dead man's throat. Mark's father picks it up and sees that it's covered with blood, and he finally realizes what's happening. He flees the house, taking the necklace with him because it's got his fingerprints on it. Mark sees his father running down the street and manages to grab him out of the way, just as he's about to be hit by a car. This is the alternate world that the original Mark is currently stuck in. In another reality, Mark gives the pretty girl at the bus stop his umbrella, and then leaves without a word. He then gets stopped by a restaurant owner who complains about his father getting drunk and making a mess at her place. Because of these delays, Mark is too late to save his father from being killed by the hit-and-run driver. He loses his father, but he gains a friendship with Mina, only to be devastated by her death 12 years later. This is the original world. The series is back in the present, where Mark freezes as he sees his father in this alternate reality. Technically, the father is alternate Mark's father. Mark learns that the father was imprisoned for 10 years for the murder of Mina's father. He starts to leave, but Mark asks him shakily what really happened 12 years ago. He sobs, knowing that his father is innocent, and asks why he was framed for the murder. His father says he doesn't remember anything, as he was too drunk. While his father sleeps, Mark stays up late, researching the world's version of the Mukyong residential murder. He sees that in this reality, Section Chief O had arrested his father as the killer, while in the original one, she had the case closed since he was already dead. At work, Mark is called to alternate Director O's office. He mentions the Mukyong residential murder and insists that his father was framed. Mark learns that his other self was also suspicious of the same thing. He mentions the stolen jewelry from the case and says that he's seen it recently. He says that this murder was only the beginning of a serial murder case, but Section Chief O seems to have heard this all before from Alt Mark. Next, Mark gets on the train at the Mukyong station that exists in this world. He rides around, paying close attention when the time reaches 9:35 p.m. But nothing happens. He thinks about the first time he saw the train and realizes a major factor. Every time the train arrives at the abandoned station, it is raining. He asks someone at the station and learns that there's a specific train, number 8210, that's used when it's raining. But he's told that it is an old train that's being retired because the last time it ran, there was almost a big accident. The next scene shows the train 8210 in the rail yard. A man walks inside, takes a pill from a bottle, and continues on his way, dragging his right foot. He then finds a case file that was dropped during the commotion when Mark was being chased by the police. Inside are photos of Mark and Mina together, which means the file is from Mark's original world. Mark goes to the rail yard to check out the train and calls the police station to ask why the cops were on the train in the first place, the night he rode it between worlds. He learns that there was a tip-off saying that he was on the train. This is when he realizes that his alternate self was also on the train. While Mark was stranded in this world that night, alternate Mark ended up in his world. Meanwhile, in the original world, alternate Mark wakes up in the hospital and watches the news about the 6th victim that was found at the closed Mukyong station over a week ago. He's confused to hear that Mukyong station is closed. Jungmin bursts in and he asks her why the news says that Mukyong station is closed and about the serial murders. Jungmin worries that Mark is mentally unstable at the moment. Back in the alternate world, Mark finds fresh dirt on the floor of the train. Suddenly, a phone rings and he warily picks it up. A distorted voice says, "All of us live many lives simultaneously." The voice adds that Mark crossed over the boundary. Mark accuses the man of killing Mina, and for all of the killings from 12 years ago to now. The man just laughs and asks how he'll prove it when the train is damaged and the passage between worlds is closed. The man then threatens Mark to live in silence unless he wants to lose something else he values. He drops the phone, and Mark hears the thump and rushes towards the sound, but the man is gone. Outside the train, he finds a fire in a barrel and a photo of himself and Mina on the ground. Meanwhile, Mina transfers to Mukyong police station, and a rookie detective June invites her to dinner with the rest of the team. She abruptly refuses, telling him that there's no need for a welcome dinner either, because she won't attend anyway. Next, Mina visits her therapist, Dr. Seok, and talks about the night her father died, and how Mark's father said in court that he can't remember anything, while she can't forget. Mina is still enraged that Mark's father lives a normal life. The following day, Mark and Mina are assigned to investigate a missing persons case. They drive up to a house where they join up with Jae Hyuk and the rookie detective June. The detectives learn that an older woman named Jung Kyung-hee has been missing for 2 weeks, and her daughter Sun-mi was away, which is why it's only now being reported. While interrogating the daughter, Mark spots a portrait of the family, and with horror, he recognizes the missing woman as the 6th victim who was found in his world. He recalls that they found dye from making car seats on her fingers, and Sun-mi confirms that her mother worked at an automobile parts factory. Meanwhile, Jae Hyuk finds a half-burned note outside, and Sun-mi identifies the handwriting as the tenant who rents her mom's guest house. The detectives learn that Kyung-hee would often fight with her tenant, as he wouldn't pay the rent. The tenant used to be an ex-convict before moving in, and would regularly get drunk and threaten to kill people. Jesus, evict this guy already. Mark informs other detectives that Kyung-hee is dead, but that they won't find her body, so they'll have to find the killer without it. Back in the original world, alternate Mark looks over the case file on the 6th victim found at this world's Mukyong station. There's a note that no jewelry stolen from the Mukyong residential murder was found on the victim, and Alt Mark's eyes go hard as he looks at the ruby ring. In a flashback, we see alternate Mark slapping around Lee Jin-sung from the alternate world, and he picks up the ring which falls from her pocket. Jin-sung had stammered that there was a woman's body in the suitcase he'd found, and that the ring had fallen out of it. In the alternate world, Mark and Jae Hyuk head to the landscaping company where Kyung-hee's tenant works. He hears them asking his boss about him and takes off in the company truck. Mark and Jae Hyuk give chase, but they soon lose him. Meanwhile, June finds an invoice at Kyung-hee's house from a kitchen appliance store and reports it to Mina. She calls Mark and lets him know that the tenant purchased a meat cutting machine on the day that Kyung-hee disappeared. Just then, she hears something and says that she thinks the tenant is back, and then the line goes dead. Mark hurries back to Kyung-hee's house. Mina sneaks back to the tenant's house, picking up an empty soju bottle on the way to use it as a weapon. The tenant bursts out of the door and crashes into her, kicking her viciously, while she hangs onto his leg, and he gets away. Mina goes inside the tenant's house and finds the place on fire and full of smoke, but Mark arrives in time to get her back outside safely. She tries to go back inside to salvage any evidence of Kyung-hee's murder, but Mark gives her a direct order to stay out. She pulls away, and they all search for the tenant on foot. The tenant attacks Mark when he sees him get close, and he pins Mark down and begins to strangle him with his bare hands. Mark sees his face for the first time, and he freezes in shock. it's Jin Woo. Only this Jin Woo isn't the gentle, kind detective that Mark knows from his world. Jae-hyuk knocks Jin Woo off of Mark, and as he's being cuffed, Jin Woo screams that he didn't steal anything. At the same time, in the original world, Jin Woo visits alternate Mark's hospital room and finds himself roughly pinned to the wall before Jung Min breaks them up. Back in the alternate world, Mina finds the meat cutting machine. The alternate Jung Min and a luminol spray shows that there's blood on the blade. The blood is then sent for analysis. While Jin Woo waits to be questioned in the interrogation room, Mark wonders if he could really be the culprit. This Jin Woo has a long rap sheet, including a felony assault case from when he was a teenager. Mark goes into the interrogation room and Jin Woo snarls that 4 years ago, Mark had framed him for robbery. Mark scans Jin Woo's file, then tells the team that Jin Woo didn't kill his landlord, and leaves to report to Director Oh. Just as Mark is about to explain to the director why he doesn't think Jin Woo is guilty, Mina enters her office. He tells the director that Jin Woo was only released from jail 6 months ago, so he's not a suspect. She says that Jung Kyung-hee only went missing 2 weeks ago, but Mark can't tell her what he knows about the timeline of the other murders, which all happened within the last 3 years, when the alternate Jin Woo was in prison. Instead, he explains that he's independently investigating a string of serial murders, and that Kyung-hee is the latest victim. Mina leaves the office and stalks the station halls. Just then, she gets a call from someone listed in her phone as simply the woman. She has a sudden memory of huddling against a wall as a woman throws things at her. She ignores the call, but when she steps outside, there's someone in a car waiting for her. Next, Mina's therapist, Dr. Seok, finds Mina in his waiting room as he's leaving work. She anxiously tells him that the woman came to see her, and she stares at her wrist scars as she recalls the woman screaming at her. The doctor tries to soothe her. Back in the alternate world, Mark asks June to read Jin Woo's file. He learns about the felony assault when Jin Woo was in high school. He then remembers his own world's version of the case. One day, when he was a new cop, he'd found Jin Woo's grandmother sobbing by her marketplace stall. Some boys from Jin Woo's school had destroyed her stall, and Jin Woo had run off with a large knife. Jin Woo had followed the boys to an abandoned warehouse and was prepared to stab one of them, but at the last second, Mark grabbed the blade and stopped him. It had changed Jin Woo's life, and he'd become a cop because of his respect for Mark. But in the alternate world, Mark hadn't been there to stop Jin Woo, so he'd stabbed the boy, and his life had been ruined. Mark then goes into the interrogation room and tells Jin Woo that he believes he's innocent of Kyung-hee's murder. He asks why Jin Woo started the fire and brought the cutting machine. Jin Woo refuses to say, suspicious that Mark is trying to set him up. But he does tell Mark that he'd often given Kyung-hee a ride home from the train station, and that on the day she disappeared, he saw a strange car along the road she usually walked. He's amused by Mark's interest, and he sneers that he won't tell Mark anymore until he's set free. Mark offers Mina a ride to the crime scene. Upon reaching there, he walks the shortcut where Kyung-hee would have been that night, and just off the path, he finds her cell phone. It indicates that this is where Kyung-hee was grabbed, and Mark tells Mina that Jin Woo would have no reason to attack her way out here when they live in the same house. On top of that, the DNA results from the meat cutter are back, and the blood on it is from an animal. Meanwhile, Jin Woo manages to escape from his cell. After learning about this, Mina is suspicious of why Jin Woo would try so hard to escape if he's innocent. Mark recalls Jin Woo saying that he would punish anyone who hurts those he loves. Mark realizes Jin Woo is after whoever is responsible for his grandmother's death. While Jae-hyuk and June check out the building where Jin Woo's grandmother ran her market stall, Mark and Mina find a digital camera in Jin Woo's truck. On it are photos of a house, inside and out, at all times of the day. Jae-hyuk calls Mark with information that the building where Jin Woo's grandmother and other vendors ran her stalls had some trouble last year with the construction company that was slated to redevelop the area. A violent protest broke out, badly injuring Jin Woo's grandmother, one of the company's employees. She later died in the hospital. The company responsible is Gun Hyung Development. Knowing that Jin Woo likely plans to go after his target right away, Mark calls for backup. Mark, Jae-hyuk, and June arrive at the house at the same time, but the doors are locked, and they've been unable to reach the owner. In the next scene, we see that Jin Woo is already inside, standing over the sleeping homeowner with a large knife. Jin Woo raises the knife, but Mark arrives in the room to grab his arm. But he is thrown across the room. As Jin Woo proceeds to attack Mark, Jae-hyuk arrives and fires on Jin Woo from the doorway. Mina runs in just seconds later and flips on the lights, and she notices that the homeowner is still in bed. They all realize at the same time that she is already dead, and Mark recognizes her as Jo Young Ran, Mina's abusive stepmother. Just then, Mina notices a necklace that Young Ran is wearing. It's the one that had belonged to her mother, and it even still has her mother's initials on the back.